Welcome back to the Perfect Quest podcast, your guide to a better journey. Today we're diving deep into the latest developments surrounding the war in Ukraine. It's a conflict that, well, after more than 3 years now, continues to send shockwaves across the globe. Our mission today is really to unpack the flurry of news around potential peace talks, get a clear snapshot of where the conflict actually stands right now, and understand its continuing impact on the world stage. We're drawing on the latest reports, of course.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack this. Starting with the potential for that high-stakes meeting in Istanbul. We know Ukrainian President Zelensky has agreed to be there on Thursday. He's meeting with Turkish President Erdogan, and the anticipation is that Russian President Putin might join them.
Right, but here's where it gets, well, really interesting, isn't it? Because while Zelensky's attendance seems pretty firm, the Kremlin is playing its cards very close to its chest regarding Putin. Their spokesperson is being deliberately vague, sort of saying, well, they'll announce his participation if and when they see fit. And this comes even as U.S. President Trump has publicly stated his expectation that both leaders will be present. That definitely adds a layer of diplomatic pressure, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, it does. And if we consider the history here, the skepticism from Ukrainian lawmakers is, well, it's quite understandable. They seem to be viewing this potential Istanbul meeting through the lens of past experiences, particularly those 2022 Istanbul agreements.
Ah, yes, those talks.
Their concern, basically, is that Russia might be using this as a kind of delaying tactic. Avoid a real ceasefire and maybe push for those same old demands.
Demands that Ukraine saw as basically asking for capitulation back then.
Exactly. Things like a drastically reduced Ukrainian military, severe limits on their defense capabilities.
And ceding control of significant territories, right? Including recognizing Russia's annexation.
Precisely. It's hard to see how those terms would be acceptable now, especially after all the immense sacrifices Ukraine has made.
Yeah, it really is.
And what's fascinating here, potentially, is the strategic calculation behind Russia's approach. Some analysts suggest they might be aiming to sort of paint Ukraine as unwilling to negotiate, try to shift international perceptions, maybe.
Interesting angle.
There's also the possibility they just intend to reintroduce those earlier maximalist demands as a sort of starting point for any new discussion.
And Zelensky, for his part, he's been quite clear, hasn't he? He believes direct talks with Putin are the only way forward.
Yeah, he's publicly stated that lower-level discussions would be, quote, pointless for making the big decisions on ending the war.
There was that decree from 2022, though. It initially sounded like it ruled out any negotiations with Putin specifically.
Right, but Ukrainian officials have since clarified that. They say its purpose was more about preventing unauthorized individuals from negotiating, not about constraining Zelensky's own constitutional right and duty, frankly, to negotiate peace.
Okay, that makes sense. So connecting this to the wider international picture, what about the role of, say, European leaders?
Well, they're applying significant pressure. They've really laid down a marker. They're demanding a 30-day ceasefire as a precondition for any serious talks. That's huge.
A 30-day ceasefire first. Wow.
And they've even indicated that new sanctions against Russia could be on the table if this isn't agreed upon by, I believe, the end of Monday.
Sanctions possibly targeting key sectors.
That's the suggestion, yeah. Energy, financial sectors, the usual suspects, but maybe hitting harder.
So a real sense of urgency from Europe then, putting the ball firmly in Putin's court, essentially. Agree to a ceasefire, engage meaningfully.
Exactly. The leaders in Germany and France have both publicly backed this stance, reinforcing that threat of more sanctions.
Okay, so this brings us to the crucial question then. What is the current status of the conflict itself, after more than 2 years of this brutal fighting?
It's a pretty sobering picture, unfortunately. Following Russia's annexation of Crimea back in 2014, the full-scale invasion in February 2022 has led to Russia now occupying roughly 20% of Ukrainian territory.
20%. That's a huge chunk of the country.
It is. And they've actually made further gains just this year in 2024, several thousand square kilometers more.
And the human cost, I mean, it's just devastating.
Utterly. We're looking at civilian casualties well over 40,000. And then you have millions of Ukrainians displaced inside their own country, plus millions more who've had to flee abroad as refugees.
The scale of the humanitarian need. It's almost unimaginable. Over 12 million people needing assistance.
It really is. And despite ongoing diplomatic efforts, particularly from the U.S. since February, trying to foster these peace talks, the military situation on the ground remains incredibly tense.
Still intense fighting.
Oh, yes. There are reports of a buildup of Russian forces near the Sumy Oblast. The Eastern Front, especially around Donetsk, is seeing constant heavy fighting. Russia's focus seems to be very much on capturing the town of Chasiv Yar right now.
And we're still seeing those missile and drone attacks.
Yes, and worryingly, they seem to have escalated against Ukrainian civilians recently.
It sounds like Russia is prioritizing just throwing bodies at the problem, maintaining troop strength.
Well, Putin has claimed these huge numbers of voluntary enlistments each month, maybe 50, 60,000.
Do we believe those numbers?
They might be strategically inflated, for negotiation leverage, perhaps. But reports do suggest they are managing to generate enough forces to replace their losses, and maybe even slightly increase their overall troop presence in Ukraine.
How are they managing that?
Partly, it seems, by deploying recruits very rapidly, often with quite limited training, setting them straight into these highly attritional, dangerous infantry assaults.
That sounds incredibly costly in human lives.
Absolutely. There also seems to be a longer-term strategic goal emerging. Evidence suggests Russia is aiming to build a substantial post-war reserve force, maybe with an eye towards a potential future conflict with NATO.
Really? What evidence points to that?
We're seeing expansion of military infrastructure in Western Russia, things that look like preparations for a larger, more sustained military posture.
And tactically on the ground, any changes?
Interestingly, yes. There are reports that the Russian military is adapting. They're apparently establishing a doctrine for using motorcycles, even civilian vehicles, in frontal assault.
Motorcycles? Seriously?
It sounds unconventional, but it's likely a countermeasure to try and mitigate Ukraine's advantages with drones, which have been so effective. Speed and dispersal, perhaps?
Wow. That highlights the constant evolution on the battlefield, doesn't it?
It really does.
Okay.
Okay, so let's maybe zoom out now and consider what all of this means for the wider world.
Yes, the global impact. When we try to draw some conclusions there, what are the key takeaways?
Well, if we look at the broader implications, the war has just had a profound effect on the global economy, no question. Ukraine's own economy has shrunk dramatically. That's led to a surge in poverty, food insecurity within Ukraine itself, which is tragic given it was such a major pre-war exporter of crops, a breadbasket.
And the Black Sea Grain Initiative, that helped for a while, didn't it?
It did provide some relief, allowed some exports, but its termination has raised really serious concerns again about global food availability and, price stability down the line. The EU's solidarity lanes offer an alternative route, but they come with higher costs for Ukrainian farmers. It's not a perfect solution.
And Russia's economy, how has it fared under sanctions?
It's shown more resilience than many initially expected. Partly that's due to massive war-related government spending, and partly redirecting exports, especially energy, towards Asia.
But it's not all smooth sailing for them.
No, definitely not. Inflation remains a significant challenge inside Russia, and the sanctions do appear to be forcing a shift in their manufacturing more towards military production, potentially starving other sectors, like, say, car manufacturing.
And globally, what have been the biggest ripple effects?
The conflict clearly exacerbated the cost of living crisis that many countries were already facing. It drove up food prices, energy prices. Developing economies, especially those heavily reliant on food and fertilizer imports from the region, have been hit particularly hard by rising food insecurity.
Energy prices obviously soared.
They did, due to sanctions on Russia and reduced supply overall. Though, ironically, that might be accelerating the shift towards cleaner energy sources in the longer term. Silver lining? Maybe.
Perhaps. And financial markets.
They've felt the impact too, of course. Companies with close links to Russia saw significant share price declines. There's just been a lot of volatility tied to the conflict.
So it feels like we're really at a critical juncture here. These potential talks in Istanbul offer maybe a glimmer of hope, but the path forward seems incredibly complex. What are the likely scenarios if a comprehensive peace agreement isn't reached soon?
Well, in that case, we could be looking at perhaps a fragile ceasefire that doesn't really hold, or maybe a prolonged frozen conflict. Either scenario would severely impede Ukraine's recovery efforts and would likely mean only limited sanctions relief for Russia, if any.
And if the talks collapse entirely, if the ceasefire demand isn't met,
then we could very well see those threatened stronger sanctions implemented against Russia, and that would mean continued severe economic impact on both nations, probably. Ultimately, the trajectory of the conflict itself may hinge quite heavily on the level of sustained Western aid flowing to Ukraine.
Right. So while the prospect of direct talks is there, offering some possibility, the journey towards actual peace is clearly fraught with challenges,
Like
uncertainties,
uncertainties.
with massive consequences for Ukraine, for Russia, and really for the stability of the global order.
Which I think raises a key question for you, the listener, to consider. Given these deeply entrenched positions, the history of mistrust we've discussed, what fundamental shifts, on any side, would actually be necessary to achieve a truly sustainable, lasting peace in this conflict? Something to really mull over.
That's it for today's chapter. This was the Perfect Quest podcast. See you on the next journey.